The first guy crazy enough to try flying in anything electric was a French dude, like 140 years ago. The main problem back then, batteries weren't exactly long-lasting or powerful. Apple, Tesla, Samsung, modern batteries last ages. Well, not really. Even the biggest electric car battery couldn't keep a plane in the air, not for long anyway. Right now, 1 pound of airplane fuel has almost 60 times more energy than a regular battery. They would need to make the fuel tank 60 times bigger and fill it with batteries. But batteries are heavy, so you'd need to make the electric airplane more powerful to handle the weight. So then you'd need even more batteries, which would mean more weight. So you'd need to make an even stronger… you get the picture. But engineers are trying to find a balance. In 1973, 2 of them put an electric engine on a glider, and it flew for 14 minutes. Not really long enough to fly anywhere, but it was still the first manned electric aircraft flight ever. A few years later, one stayed in the air for 35 minutes. Its electric engine had only 3.5 horsepower, and its battery was borrowed from a Hughes 500 helicopter. The roof of the airplane had solar panels on it. But how much charge are you going to get in 35 minutes? Things are a lot easier when you're talking about pilotless planes. Mostly they're just way lighter. No human, no chair, no doors or extra windows, zippo. NASA's Pathfinder set a world record for an altitude of 71,000 feet. No jet engines, no fuel, just a pretty strong battery. In 1990, the Sunseeker 1 crossed the entire United States with an electric engine. It took 21 flights and 121 hours in the air. Most normal commercial planes do it in one go, and it only takes about 5 hours. After that, tech started getting way better. Time for the Solar Impulse. What a great name for a band. The wingspan of this giant was about the same as the Airbus A380, the largest passenger aircraft in the world. But its total weight was basically the same as an SUV. They put massive wings on it and loaded them up with solar panels. This time they really did recharge the plane as it flew around. It could stay in the air for an incredibly long time and travel huge distances. As part of its round-the-world trip, it spent almost 5 days in the air and traveled over 4,000 miles between Japan and Hawaii. Aloha! Why did it take 5 days? Because that thing only goes 45 miles per hour. That's like your grandma driving on the highway. My grandma has a lead foot. And you can't just build a plane. First, you need to pass through a tough certification process. Every screw, nut, bolt, every inch of your new plane needs to be tested for safety. That takes years. So many dreamers have gone another way. They take an existing aircraft, throw away the old gas-burning engine, and switch it out for an electric one. Electric engines are much lighter and they take up less space. But those heavy batteries more than make up for it. These upgraded planes can take off, but can only fly short distances, which is amazing. Jet planes emit about 1 billion tons of CO2 a year. They're a major player in the pollution game. But half of all flights in the world are less than 500 miles long. It's one thing to get a giant plane in the air to travel from New York to Paris, but it's totally different if you only need to fly New York to DC or Seattle to Vancouver. They're only a few hundred miles, but they use some of the same planes. It's crazy. They literally take off, gain the right altitude, and immediately begin their descent. That's like driving to your own mailbox in a tank. Each hour in the air costs the airlines thousands and pumps a bunch of CO2 into the atmosphere. So let's do it. Step 1. Replace the fuel-munching planes with electric ones. It'll be cheaper for everyone, quieter, and cleaner. Done. Just one problem. Electric planes can only take 1 to 2 passengers at a time. That's the pilot and co-pilot. The way forward? Build an electric plane from scratch. Eviation Alice. It might just be the first fully electric commercial aircraft, carrying 9 passengers and 2 crew members. It looks kind of like an overturned boat and has 3 propellers, 2 on the wings and 1 behind its V-shaped tail. As long as a school bus, as wide as a limo. Its secret? It's almost twice as light as a school bus. That helps the engines work less and means longer flights. It's made of composite materials, which is science talk for stuff that's not metal, basically what some boats are made of. And its batteries take up 60% of its weight. They're everywhere, in the wings, tail, beak, eyes, feathers. Just kidding. Alice has a max range of 650 miles. That's like LA to Vegas and back. And then back to Vegas one more time. Its cruising speed is only 275 miles per hour, much slower than fuel-powered planes. But the main advantage of Alice is money. 1 hour in the air costs the airline $200. That's way cheaper than even those tiny planes that millionaires use to fly to Cabo for the weekend. So what's aviation waiting for? Mostly it needs infrastructure. But that might not be such a big problem. There are almost 20,000 airports in the USA. Most of them are unused because they're just too expensive to run or because no airline wanted to bother flying there anymore. But Alice is much cheaper to maintain and it makes a lot less noise. Imagine the airport of the future, small, stylish, quiet, and clean. Engineers want to charge Alice with mobile chargers, like an electric version of those gas trucks you see at the airport. For a 1-hour flight, Alice needs to juice up for 30 minutes. That's actually not that bad. But imagine if you were going to take a 14-hour flight on that thing. You'd be waiting at the gate for 7 hours. Alice costs $800 less per hour than other planes. But the plane itself is pretty expensive. Try $4 million. Still, that's only a bit more than one of those private jets. Alice is getting ready for a 2022 fully certified flight. That means it's only a few years before regional flights go electric, at least some of them. But if electric planes want to play in the big leagues, they need to solve that same old problem, their batteries. Modern lithium-ion batteries have serious issues. They're flammable, they lose their charge faster and faster, the more you recharge them, and the cold makes them not work as well. The next generation of batteries is lithium-sulfur batteries. They hold more power and are cleaner for the environment. But their main disadvantage is that they wear out quickly. So scientists are looking for other tech to step up. Hybrid planes might be the way of the future. That's what cars are doing more and more now. Part fuel, part battery. Airplanes will probably be the same. There are already lightweight two-seater planes that use a hybrid engine. The aircraft takes off quietly with the energy stored in its batteries. Once it's up in the air, it changes to fuel. Some engines actually charge the battery while it's working, sort of like your car battery. Electric planes aren't the only way forward. Some companies are working on biofuel planes, which run on hydro something veggie oil. But those planes are also pretty small. Probably the next big thing to hit the airline industry will be driverless planes. Computers already do a ton of the heavy lifting, and if you fly long distance, most of it's on autopilot already. Even though it's so freaky to think that there's no one up there flying your plane, most problems are caused by human error. So, no human, no errors? Most customers say they don't like the idea, but that'll probably change soon enough. Ooh, I wonder if they're gonna make AI robot cabin crew. Or what if tiny drones flew around the cabin serving drinks?
You've probably seen Hollywood movies where somehow a small hole opens up in the side of a plane and then immediately it's utter chaos. Food trays and bags flying, seatbelts barely holding passengers in place. Luckily, in reality, small damage to the fuselage won't cause such dramatic consequences. But would you believe me if I told you there was a pilot that managed to land a plane with half the roof torn completely off? Buckle up. At 1:25 p.m. on April 28, 1988, a 19-year-old Boeing 737 that belonged to Aloha Airlines left Hilo International Airport and headed for Honolulu. The plane was named after Queen Liliuokalani, who was the last sovereign monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii. On that day, the aircraft already had 3 short flights from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Apologies to the people of Hawaii for any mispronounced names. Anyway, all the trips were regular and uneventful. The weather was calm, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. The captain was experienced pilot Robert Schornsteimer, 44 years old, who had 6,700 flight hours in the Boeing 737. The first officer was Madeline Tompkins, 36 years old, who had flown more than 3,500 hours in the very same Boeing model. Early in the morning, still in Honolulu, the first officer had conducted the regular pre-flight inspection and announced that the plane was ready for the flight. At 11 a.m., the plane left Honolulu and headed for Maui and then to Hilo. When the plane arrived at the destination, the pilots didn't leave the cockpit or inspect the aircraft from the outside. After all, it wasn't a requirement, so they didn't have to. Following schedule, the plane started the last leg on the routine round trip at 1:25 p.m. There were 95 people on board the aircraft, 89 passengers, 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and an FAA traffic controller who stayed in the observer seat in the cockpit. After a normal takeoff and ascent, the plane got to the usual cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, and then, at about 1:48 p.m., 26 miles away from Kahului, the unexpected happened. Those who were in the cockpit heard a loud whooshing sound and then a crack, followed by the deafening sound of wind seconds later. Apparently, a small part of the roof on the left side tore loose, which led to the explosive decompression of the plane. But the worst thing was that the decompression caused a ripple effect, which led to a huge section of the airplane's roof to tear off completely. The length of the missing part was 18.5 feet long. It was all part of the aircraft's skin that covered the plane from the cockpit back to the forewing area. At first, the pilots didn't realize what had happened. The first officer, who was in control of the aircraft at that moment, felt her head jerk backward, and she noticed debris and gray pieces of insulation flying chaotically around the cockpit. When the captain turned his head, he saw that the cockpit door had disappeared, and instead of the first-class ceiling, he was staring at a clear blue sky. The plane started to roll from side to side, and it was becoming increasingly harder to control. Everybody who was in the cockpit immediately put on their oxygen masks, and the captain took over the aircraft. He prodded the speed brakes into action and began an emergency descent towards the nearest airport, which was on Maui Island. Luckily, all the passengers were in their seats at the moment when the accident happened, and since the seatbelt sight was still on, everyone had their seatbelts fastened. However, all 3 flight attendants were standing along the aircraft aisle. The one who was the closest to the front of the plane was swept out through the hole in the roof. The other 2 were thrown to the floor by a forceful jerk. But while one of them hit her head really hard and lost consciousness, the other one started to crawl along the aisle in an attempt to help passengers and calm them down. At that same time, the pilots were trying to contact air traffic control and signal an emergency. To make matters worse, they couldn't hear each other and had to use gestures to communicate. They also didn't know whether the radio worked and whether they had managed to deliver their message. The flight controls were sluggish and loose, and the captain was struggling to control the plane. The first officer, right by his side, dealing with communication and assisting the captain. It turned out that the controller hadn't been receiving the crew's messages until the aircraft descended to the altitude of 14,000 feet. Only then did the signal get through, and Maui Tower started urgent preparations for an emergency landing. The problem was that at that time, in case of an emergency, the airport control tower had to dial 911 just like anyone else. On top of that, the controller didn't catch that the passengers and crew members would need medical help. After all, the crew only announced that they had experienced a rapid decompression, so the controller wasn't aware of the entire gravity of the situation. In the meantime, the plane had already dropped to a height of 10,000 feet above sea level. The captain removed his oxygen mask and withdrew the speed brakes. The plane was steadily descending toward runway 2 of Kahului Airport. Following the captain's command, the first officer lowered the landing gear, but the indicator light didn't come on. That could mean that either they had a bad light, or they had serious problems with the nose gear. But that wasn't the only problem. As the plane was approaching the runway, the left engine failed, and the aircraft started rocking and shaking. The captain made an attempt to restart the engine, but didn't succeed. And yet, still, with the help of the reverse thrust of the second, still working engine, at 1:58 p.m., just 10 minutes after the emergency and 35 minutes after the takeoff, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 did manage to touch down on the runway of Kahului Airport and come to a complete stop. Landing a plane with such a huge loss of integrity was an unprecedented feat. As soon as the plane stopped, the evacuation began. Everyone on the plane, except for the one flight attendant who had been pulled out of the plane, was alive, although 65 people were injured. Most people had been hurt by flying debris and torn pieces of fuselage. Unfortunately, since nobody on the ground had known how serious the situation was, no ambulances were waiting for the injured. The first one arrived 7 minutes after the plane landed, and there were only 2 ambulances on the entire island, which obviously couldn't fit all the people. That's why the passengers had to be transported to the hospital in several 15-passenger tour vans that belonged to the company Akamai Tours. Luckily, 2 Akamai drivers used to be paramedics, so they started to tend to the injured right on the runway. Meanwhile, airport mechanics, as well as office staff, drove the vans to the hospital, which was 3 miles away. Luckily, there were only 8 serious injuries, from which all of these passengers later recovered. As for the plane, it was damaged beyond repair and later dismantled right at the airport. The missing part of the roof disappeared and was never seen again. But what could cause such a terrible accident? The problem wasn't the age of the aircraft. 19 years isn't that old for a commercial plane, and it hadn't accumulated too many flight hours before the accident happened. But the 35,500 flight hours the plane had traveled included 89,680 takeoffs and landings, which are also called flight cycles. The reason for such a huge number was that the plane performed mostly short domestic flights between the islands. And this number exceeded the number of flight cycles the plane was designed for twice over. Besides, the plane traveled in a salty and humid environment, which also added to the wear and tear. Interestingly, during one interview that followed the accident, passenger Gail Yamamoto remembered that she had spotted a crack in the fuselage when she was boarding. Unfortunately, she was the only one who had seen the damage, and the woman hadn't thought that the crack was important enough to inform the crew. It's important to stress that these kinds of accidents are extremely rare these days. According to Harvard University, given all the steps and measures major airlines and airports take to ensure safety, the odds of you being in an airplane accident is roughly 1 in 1.2 million. That's a 0.0000083% chance. I don't know about you, but I like those odds. And even if something were to happen, like, for example, half the roof falling off, it's a great comfort to know that your trained pilots can still land the plane relatively safely.
Do you know the feeling when you've been trying to solve one mystery for your entire life? Nope? Well, Detective Anderson does. During almost 30 years of working for the police, he solved many riddles, caught hundreds of robbers, and helped save thousands of lives. There's a huge number of successfully solved cases on his record. At the age of 25, he caught a thief who changed his own face with plastic surgery once a year. When Anderson was 30, prisoners started breaking from jails all over the world. The detective successfully solved this case. At the age of 38, he discovered the secret base of a forbidden order in a volcano's mouth. By his 50s, he managed to explain all the most inexplicable things in the world. But there was something he couldn't solve. These were 2 mysteries from the 50s, cases of missing planes. All these years, Anderson has been scrolling through the details of this puzzle. Unfortunately, he was too young when this story began. All he had were guesses and notes. But today, a sudden thought struck him. For the first time in many years, he felt that he could finally solve this mystery. But to do this, he had to immerse himself in this story again. So he opened the closet and pulled out 2 old magazines with detailed articles about these incidents. The first one happened in the summer of 1955. July 1st, Pan Am Flight 914 was about to depart from New York Airport with 61 people on board. The plane model was a Douglas DC-4. It differed from modern aircraft, having giant propellers instead of turbines. So, all passengers fastened their seatbelts. The plane started taxiing down the runway, sped up, and took off. It went high into the sky and out of sight. Its destination was Florida. The flight time would be 3 hours. Dispatching services were watching the plane on their radar, when suddenly, Pan Am 914 disappeared. The operator tried to contact the pilot, but received no response. New York reported this to Florida. They said they couldn't see the plane either. Usually, pilots notify via radio if a plane crashes or gets into a storm. But this time, just nothing. After several unsuccessful attempts to establish the connection, they deployed large-scale search operations. Communication with the plane was interrupted when it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, the air company had to admit the aircraft crashed into the water. But this version had no proof. When planes fall that way, rescuers find floating debris. Some parts of the cabin or luggage always get to the surface. This time, rescuers found nothing. The plane didn't transmit any distress signals and didn't leave any traces of the crash. It seemed like it just disappeared into thin air. People forgot about this disaster for 37 years. And then, something bizarre happened. 1992, Venezuela, Caracas Airport. The control tower received a signal about an unknown aircraft approaching them. It was weird because it wasn't supposed to be there. There were no flights scheduled for that time. The plane was landing. The dispatcher and the rest of the airport staff understood that something was wrong here. The plane looked old, with huge propellers instead of turbines. After landing, the pilot contacted the airport.
Where are we?
The dispatcher asked him to identify himself. A few seconds later, he received an answer.
We are Pan Am Flight 914, departed from New York to Florida, with a crew of 4 people and 57 passengers on board.
The dispatcher didn't know what to do next. He and the airport staff understood what kind of plane they were looking at. What was this plane doing 37 years later, and almost 1,240 miles away from its destination? After a few seconds, the startled dispatcher turned on the microphone and said,
It is September 9th, 1992. You know that?
A long pause followed. Then, the pilot responded in a panic.
Oh no. Jimmy, where are we? No! Stay away! Let's go now!
The airport staff saw the pilot waving his hands in horror through the glass. Then, he started the engines and took the plane to the runway. Pan Am 914 increased its speed and took off. The dispatcher tried to stop him, but the pilot didn't respond. The plane disappeared into the sky, and no one else had heard of it since that day. Detective Anderson finished reading the article. He frowned and looked out the window. Raindrops were hitting the glass. The storm outside perfectly depicted what was happening in his mind at that moment. He seemed to know what had happened to that plane. All the clues were there, lying right in front of his eyes. But to know for sure, Anderson had to move on to the next case. It was another article, dated 1989. It happened in 1954. Santiago Airlines Flight 513 took off from West Germany Airport. The plane was due to land in Brazil in 18 hours. There were 88 passengers and 4 crew members on board. The plane hid behind the clouds and disappeared from all radar. Air traffic controllers were trying to contact the pilots, but didn't receive a response. 18 hours later, they called the airport in Brazil. Those dispatchers couldn't confirm this plane's landing and couldn't contact the pilots either. The search operation lasted for several months, but they found nothing. Just like in the Pan Am 914 case, the plane disappeared from radar while flying over the Atlantic Ocean. 2 years later, the search operation ended, and Santiago Airlines ceased its activities. October 12, 1989. Airport controllers in Brazil noticed a passenger plane that suddenly appeared on their radar. It didn't answer the airport staff's questions and just circled over the airbase. After a few minutes, the plane landed and nothing. No one opened the ramp. Passengers didn't get out. Pilots didn't respond. The aircraft was in perfect condition. One of the dispatchers realized that this was the missing Santiago Airlines Flight 513 that had been considered lost for 35 years. Airport staff approached the plane and opened the doors. What they saw there terrified them. The police, customs staff, doctors, detectives, and other airport staff members gathered around the plane. No one knew what to do next. There was no living person on board who could tell the truth. The plane disappeared in 1954 and appeared 35 years later in perfect condition without any damage. So far, no one has figured out what happened. Detective Anderson noticed the stories were very similar. Pan Am 914 disappeared in 1955. Santiago Airlines 513 vanished in 1954. The difference was almost a year. Anderson scratched his head and noticed another little detail. Both planes went missing from the radar the moment they were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. There are many myths about phantom ships and mysterious phenomena connected with the Bermuda Triangle. Detective Anderson knew these tales, but these two missing planes puzzled him. He looked at two articles and understood everything. Exactly! The solution was there, right in front of his eyes. Both stories were written in the same newspaper. There was no real dispatcher who communicated with the planes. Nothing was known about the passengers. No newspapers except this one published news about these missing aircraft. It seemed they just took the same story and changed the dates, locations, and names of flights. Yes, the case was solved. It was all fake. The rain stopped. Detective Anderson looked out the window and heard the sound of a passing train. He remembered another weird and fake story, a story about a phantom train. It took place in Italy in 1911. 100 passengers boarded the train of the Zanetti Railway Company. It went through the picturesque mountainous area, got into a mountain tunnel, and disappeared. No one else had seen the train since then. All the passengers were lost, but not for long. They appeared in the past. There were records dated 1845. One unknown doctor from Mexico City wrote about 100 Italians who appeared in the city from nowhere. They were all dressed strangely and talked about one mysterious train. This was a completely made-up story. There was no proof or records about this train and the people who got into the past. A loud sound interrupted his thoughts. Detective Anderson picked up the phone. He was silently listening to the person on the other end of the line. A minute later, he answered, "Yes." The detective put the phone down. It was a new mystery for him. In the Sahara Desert, the locals noticed a huge ship lost in the South Pacific 27 years ago. There was no crew on board, no cargo, and no flags. No one knew how it appeared among the sand, but wet mud formed around it because of moisture. It seemed like the ship had just teleported there from the water. Perfect! No fakes this time. Detective Anderson put on his hat and left the office. But this story is for another video.